Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations. Hello, testing.
There we go.
This is take two.
This is take two. Yes.
For the record, we just did all of our intro, and we were really going strong.
We were doing great.
We were. You would subscribe to this podcast so fast if you would have heard what we did not record.
No doubt.
So let's start over.
Let's start over again. How are you?
I was better the first time.
Were you?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm good.
You feeling a little more bruised and battered now, are you?
Yeah.
Physically?
Yes, physically and mentally.
I hear you.
Well, we were just talking about how we played Ultimate Frisbee last night, so that's what we're talking about.
Actually, you played Ultimate Frisbee. You were part of the Ultimate. You were in the air and you were on the ground. You just had the extremes going.
You know, there's a time where that needs to stop, though. I think I'm getting there because I had to get up in the middle of the night to take some Advil, so.
I hear you.
Yeah, just to make it into the to the studio this morning.
That's right.
This is our studio, Mark. What do you think?
I think it works well. I'm glad to be here.
By the way, this is Mark Pratt.
And this is Justin Sternberg. And
and by this, I mean I am Justin Sternberg.
That's true. And this is How I See It. This is our podcast. We are just kind of kicking off this morning and wanted to come and just share some perspective of how we see it, recognizing that not everybody sees things from the same perspective. And maybe in some ways kind of our passion, if you will, is how culture has polarized that or become more polarized.
Yeah, and like basically trying to peg you. Are you this or are you that?
Sure.
And name it, And like the goal is to make it as easy as possible to identify people and figure out who they are. And I think this podcast, a big idea of it is that we want to talk about what it looks like to be in the middle of those two perspectives. Like, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Well, what does it look like to be mostly Democrat with some Republican tendencies or vice versa? Like, is that possible? Because culture right now has a hard time with that concept. And you take that and you apply it to any polarizing concept, right?
Or any continuum.
Yeah.
I don't think it always has to be so polarizing. I think that becomes part of what we're seeing is there's probably far more areas or continuums, if you will, where we might be able to be very similar and see things from a similar perspective. But yet there's that one or two or three or four areas that we label others by because we notice the extreme based on it being different than how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's even been times, I mean, that's one of the big reasons we even started considering the idea of a podcast is there's been many times where you and I have started out on kind of different ends of a conversation thinking, oh, you're like that, I'm like this. And as we talked, we realized like we continue to move towards each other in terms of really understanding we're not that different. In fact, we might think exactly the same thing.
Sure.
But we came at it from the other side of the perspective and arrived at that middle where we pretty much agreed this is exactly how I would handle this situation, or this is exactly how I think about that thing, and it ended up being the same or very similar, right?
And I think it's a good point because so often we start with a perspective, and then through conversation we recognize that perspective wasn't actually that accurate.
Right. Yep. And we even sometimes do that to ourselves. Like,
we'll
hold on to a certain politics keep coming in mind, but like a party line idea, right? And
Sure.
we'll say, well, I have to believe this because this is the party I'm in, and just replace party with whatever the topic is, right? And we'll kind of quote those same things, but sometimes, again, like you're saying, we'll overstate the importance of certain things just to fit in where we think we belong, and maybe we don't even hold to that ideology, or at least not as strongly as. And so then when we put that out for others, like you said, well, now it's very difficult for them to see us as anything but that.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Well, and I think, you address the political end, but I think there's so much more, when we think about differences, even from our gender, where we are going to be, male and female on different sides of a continuum. And and even as we think about ethnicity and that kind of thing, it's like there's purpose in it all, but yet it's easy to say, well, you believe that just because you are, and we fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Versus being able to recognize that there is a purpose in this, difference, to be able to learn and to grow and to understand one another in ways that we couldn't prior to that conversation.
And to that end, I'd say a primary, what we would consider audience of this podcast would be people who like we like to think we are, seekers of truth. People who we don't want to just settle for what the status quo is, or what people say they are, or what this situation says it is, but really what is the truth behind it. And so being able to have a conversation that says, I know that you think that way because you're X, and then to say, no, actually, here's why I think this way. And then for us to go, oh, do you mean this when you say that? No, I mean this when I say that. And that conversation that goes back and forth, you work at the truth. The truth doesn't just surface for free. You have to work at it to get to the truth in a conversation like that, to get to someone's true position and true perspective. And it takes, empathic listening, right? Being able to kind of walk over to the other side and say, let me hear it from your side.
And I think what you're getting at, from my perspective, is what our culture has missed out on, is that opportunity to build relationship. In other words, our tendency, or when we look at things from such a polarized perspective, is I look at you from one facet, and therefore you are. But in the midst of having that conversation, I realize that, oh, you're more than just that. And so, and I think that plays into our desire for how I see it. So if you were to describe yourself and who you are impacts how you see it, kind of give us a nutshell of who you are.
Yeah, well, like I said, my name is Justin Sternberg, and I'm a typical white middle-aged dad.
You're not typical. You're not typical.
Okay, good. I'm not typical.
Yeah.
In the area of like politics and those kinds of things, I would say I'm left-leaning centrism. Like I'm pretty much right in the middle for a lot of things, but there are some things that I lean left towards, especially in regards to how I was raised, which was very, Republican is the only way. And again, I keep falling back to politics, but that is a pretty defining part of my journey is kind of coming out of that and rethinking things, right? And then I'll also say I'm a millennial, so I grew up on the internet. That's a big part of in fact, that's my job, right? Is working on the internet, working for the internet. And technology is a big part of what I do. I'm a creative. I like to do music. I have some younger kids, and from 8 years old to almost 15 years old. So they're still young in comparison to your kids. And so family is a huge part of what I do right now, and a pretty important focus. And I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I belong to a church called Generations Church here in Southport, North Carolina. And so those are some, I would say, defining characteristics about me.
Sure.
Yeah. How about you, Mark? Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting as I've been thinking about just this podcast. Yeah, I think you think about who you are and what you want to say. And like you, I am a believer in Jesus Christ, and unlike you, I'm 52. And and I've been married 25 years, and I have young adult children. And I think in a lot of cases that how that affects me is I've been able to see the cycles that come and go. And I think about, even as you were sharing on the political, I think about, the mornings when I woke up after elections and thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to be the end.
Wow.
The world is going to fall apart in the next 4 years because this political leader has been, elected. And I think from 52, it's like, no, that's not the case anymore. And I just see how, in take one,
right.
We talked about, how this process of, cycles that come and go. And that would be, I'll explain who I am, but I want to come back to that cycles perspective. Yeah. But part of being, I am probably, I'm not anti-technology, but I think that's one of the bigger differences. You encourage me and you challenge me to use technology, whereas I'm not quite anti, but you definitely are more, you're aware of what's out there. And maybe even in some ways, like the political, I almost choose to ignore it in some cases. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but yet I want to avoid those polarizing topics or the repeated phrase of this side of the spectrum or the repeated phrases of that side of the spectrum. And I just want to be able to have these conversations that are real and authentic.
Which I think, if I may, that you're referring to things like social media, right?
Sure, yeah.
Where I mean, really, what that is when you talk about building quote unquote followers, right, or friends, you're talking about building your own echo chamber, right?
Sure.
Because there's a good chance you're going to shut out those you disagree with, and you'll embrace those you agree with, and so that's kind of what you're saying. Like you'll continue to hear the same things over and over again because that's what you want to hear. It's kind of what you build around you.
Well, I think in our media, even what I click, helps reinforce that.
Yeah.
And I try for me personally, I want to try and avoid that.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to just be force fed the same things that I think. Because I believe that adds to the polarization.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's why I appreciate you and our differences. As we've gotten to know one another, to be able to recognize, okay, how can these differences that we have be part of our learning, part of our growth, and part of what makes us better as Christians, as fathers, as husbands, as individuals, as men, if I may say so. Just from I'm not going to be able to always understand a female perspective, and I think that's where we can, even as men, talk about that and saying, okay, what are you experiencing in your relationship, and how does that flesh out to a certain degree?
Yeah.
But go back to that, if you don't mind, kind of that viewpoint you had of this cycle.
Yeah. So what you were talking about in our first take that was not as good as this one. So it's a good thing we redid it. We were talking about seasons. That was the word, because you were talking about at your age, or in your perspective in life, you've seen seasons come and go. Quite 25 years of marriage, right? Adult children, young adult children. And so that was kind of what we were talking about, how seasons come and go, and how in every season sometimes it feels like it's not the end. And I was just describing a post I saw on social media of all places, where they kind of showed this zoomed out picture of a trajectory of someone's life, and it's kind of a zigzag, kind of, mostly pointing upward, right? Just over the course of time, a little bit of ups, a little bit of downs, and then they zoomed in on one section, and it was a downward section, and written over that downward section it said, "Everything is terrible, and it's going to be this way forever."
Sure.
Right? And then they showed a zoomed in section of a different place, right, where it's heading upwards, and everything is perfect, and it's going to be this way forever,
Exactly.
right? And it's this idea that, especially, as like I think you were talking about before, as younger married couple or younger parents or whatever, before you've seen and lived through enough of those seasons, that tends to be the perspective that you take on, right?
Sure.
Everything's terrible, and it's going to be this way forever. I don't have the job I want. My kids are disobedient, or they're not getting good grades, or whatever it is, right? Like, we just think in these, we can get stuck in these short-term, thoughts, or vice versa. You just get a raise, and whatever.
Yeah.
So, good things happening. All of a sudden, it's like, I knew my time was coming, and this is what it's meant to be forever. And we tend to lose sight of the fact that life is very cyclical and seasonal, and how important that is.
No doubt.
I think that's a huge thing that I'm learning as I get to later 30s, close to 40, is the importance of seasons, not just the reality of them.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because that's kind of exactly what I was thinking is, how can I bless others with the fact that I have seen many seasons? You follow me? And in that kind of, like when you're saying, the terrible, it's like I can remember, adolescent kids. That's probably one of the, junior high, senior high, that kind of, it's probably one of the tougher cycles that we'll experience. And for me personally, it's being able to say, yeah, I remember that, but yet still being able to use that in such a way that encourages, parents of adolescents, or, in that process, to be able to encourage in such a way that doesn't seem dismissive. Oh, that's just a phase, you'll go through it. To be able to have that empathy that understands, but even to be able to offer hope that it doesn't last forever.
So I have an interesting memory in regards to what you just said.
Yeah,
I remember being in high school and going to youth group. And I remember, I didn't know it at the time, but I was struggling with depression. I didn't have a name for it. I certainly wasn't diagnosed, but as I've gotten older and realized that's a cycle of struggle of mine, recognize that's exactly what it was. And so whatever I was going through seemed impossible to get through.
Yeah.
But when I would communicate those things to youth leaders or whatever, it was like, oh, you're just a kid. Your problems, you don't even know what problems are yet, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of that perspective. And I remember, and obviously it's still here, I clicked something in my brain and I said, when I get to their age, I'm going to be able to listen to those kids and understand how hard it is for them, because it's so hard for me right now. I'm like, someone's got to remember this and come back and be able to have these conversations, which, ironically, I think has a lot to do with why this podcast is a thing for me, right?
Sure.
To be able to say, you have a story, you have a perspective that's different than mine, and just because it's different doesn't mean it's invalid.
Sure.
And there's something there that can be uncovered in
both sides are valuable.
Yeah.
I think that can be part, it's not that, in the midst of that, one story is more important than the other. But that ability to say, okay, I really see where you're at, and that's a tough thing you're going through. And yet, in that process, it's not just because, you did this and this, it's where you're at right now. And how can I be of help to you? Not just saying, oh, well, it's a phase and it's a cycle everybody goes through. You got to endure it. It's like, what do you need right now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see, yeah, this may come. And as you and I have talked about your depression,
Mm-hmm.
you recognize that if you could just put it in a cycle dynamic and know when it's going to happen and, embrace yourself, it would be a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yet it's in those daily moments when you're saying, oh, I'm experiencing this, that it becomes that it's important to have people that actually recognize and understand what you're going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it kind of, to add to what you were saying, both perspectives are important. I think had someone come along and kind of listened, right? And kind of what you're saying, and then after listening and showing that they're supportive and loving, offered that perspective that your life right now is hard, but you're going to have more things coming, and here's my perspective, here's what's happened in my life, some of the hard things, and the good news is you can avoid some of that, but just the perspective for me to go, oh, I can look up and out of my circumstances to see there's more to life, and these struggles are hard, but they're not as hard as that struggle or this struggle that I may or may not sometime have to deal with, but this person dealt with, right?
Yeah.
I think that's still an important thing when we're, struggling with any kind of thing, to be able to have perspective on my own issue and how difficult it really is, both from my perspective as well as like an outside perspective, as well as perspective on other people and what they're going through and their struggles and how they've been able to get through certain things or not,
Yeah.
Perspective matters so much, which is the name of this podcast, essentially.
Sure.
How I see it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really about embracing perspective, I think. And
not just for the sake of perspective, though. You follow me with that? I think sometimes we can lose track of who we are in the process of, oh, I support them, I support that, I support this, I do this. When we're not necessarily taking into account the ability to be who we are, we're just trying to be somebody different than who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In a sense, I guess there's something to be said, and probably I'm saying this as an older person again, but yet knowing who I am, I'm willing to be able to, and I don't want to sound contradictory, but I'm willing to be able to support, people who are hurting, but yet I'm not necessarily going to support habits that continue to hurt individuals. You follow me?
Yeah. And that's where perspective shouldn't be the end goal. Truth should be the end goal.
Exactly.
And so, like I said, truth often lies somewhere between the two perspectives, right? Like,
sure. Yeah.
Or, there's truth in the fact that as a teenager, life is difficult. And there's also truth in the fact that you're a teenager, life isn't that difficult.
Yeah.
Those are both true, right? Like, and so if you can embrace that truth as a teenager, then that's important, to be able to say, this is hard. I do need help. I do need to seek help. I need support from people. But at the same time, I'm not the most important person in this world. This isn't the last hard thing I'm going to go through in this world. The people around me I'm asking for help, they have their own hard things they're going through in this world.
Yes.
That's the truth, right?
And I think that comes through relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Because and I think about it, even your mentioned adolescence, I think of early 20s, to a certain degree, where I may think or have the tendency to think that I know it all. So I just do my own thing my own way. And I think there's advantages to that identity, but yet to add humility to that in such a way that says, okay, I don't know it all. So who can I surround myself with to help me understand the things that I don't and even call me out when I'm heading towards arrogance.
See, when I was 20 and knew everything, I didn't want people to do that because...
And yet, didn't want
right.
and comfortable with can be two different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's where good relationships can kind of supersede even what I may want, or even what may be easy.
It's good.
Because I think relationship is hard. We have to take time for it. We have to, listen to other people in such a way that says, okay, yeah, I hear where you're coming from. And there may be people that say, no, I don't want to hear what you have to say. But then again, then they kind of experience that consequence, that natural consequence, and they might be more open to relationship and influence the second time around. So it's not like, we give up on that. But I think that's part of what we do here. We're not going to be heard by everybody. And yet, that's our disclaimer, if you will. This is how I see it.
Yeah.
And I invite you to share with me how you see it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, one thing, like a philosophical perspective that I grew up kind of under was that if you're open-minded, your brains might fall out, right?
Yeah. It's
this idea that you have to hold very strongly to every belief you have because people want to rip it out of you, almost, I guess. And that's a perspective that I've kind of come full circle on, which is there are deep abiding truths that I hold to. Again, as a Christ follower, the Bible is truth to me, and so I will go back to that, and that's the one thing I can trust, no matter what the news is saying, or no matter But that being said, everything else is on the table. I want to learn. I want to grow. I want my perspective to be as truthful as possible.
Yeah.
And that's not possible if I just cling to my beliefs I had when I was 22, right?
Sure.
I have to be able to, rethink, which is, there's an author named Adam Grant who wrote a book called Rethink.
Sure.
And he's all about that idea of rethinking what you think. And so I'm very much for that. And not for the purposes of letting my brains fall out or being willy-nilly or not having any values or character, but for the purpose of gaining stronger values, gaining stronger character.
Yeah.
And that's possible, where that wasn't something that I necessarily understood to be true growing up,
No, and I think you bring up a good point, because I think, when we tend to grow up, growing up in church, I tend to bring that perspective with me into the rest of my life of this is what church should be based on what I experienced. And I think, much of who we are as adults, not that we question that, but we're in that process of saying, okay, was this true? Was what I was taught, you get the idea. Being taught from a certain perspective, was that accurate? Yeah. And I think in church, it's easy to kind of grow up and have those moments where we say, this maybe wasn't quite biblical from that perspective, Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's many areas, what it means. We can go with church, but what does it mean to be a mom or a father, a stay-at-home parent, those kind of things? Are those okay?
Right.
Based on how I grew up, and yet, is it something that I need to consider for where I'm at right now with my family? You follow me?
Yeah.
It's like, what is God leading us to do, and where to go? Because I was thinking about this. I think it's easy for us to recognize, the power that God has, but yet we don't always think that he wants to use that in our lives right today, right here, in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
something out there. And I think, as we kind of explore, what God's calling us to, we're able to experience more of that power to transform or rethink even on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah. I mean, as we're getting into that side of things, I mean, I think we believe that we have the Holy Spirit inside of us, and so if we trust Him as we should, He's not going to allow us to stumble into some terrible belief that's anti-biblical, and that's a prayer that we can sustain, right? Like,
Sure.
show me the truth. And again, that's really, very much what this podcast is about. But it's also very much, I think, the reason we're doing this podcast is because it very much identifies who we are.
Sure.
As people who two guys who just continually are looking for what the truth is in the perspective of what God's Word says, right?
Yeah.
And so that's important to say. Like, this podcast, I think there's going to be a lot of concepts and stuff that we talk about that aren't necessarily, how do you put it, like a Bible-based podcast, so to speak.
Yeah.
But everything that we do is going to be completely with that perspective, coming from that perspective.
And I think, if I may add to what you're sharing, is that, truth for the sake of truth is one thing, but I think the fact that we can recognize that truth or walking in truth offers freedom.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes part of what we desire to offer.
Yes.
Is the freedom that we've felt by having truthful conversations. You follow me? I don't care whether it's in a hurt. I don't care whether it's in, an addiction, or even just a lifestyle change where it's like, okay, is looking at that, is drinking that, is smoking that most beneficial? Because we can recognize, it's become part of what we do, but yet is there a greater freedom without that? Because right now, the fact that I need this or I think I need that, that's part of what my truth is.
Yeah.
And I think, my current, but there's a freedom when I recognize the real truth that says, no, I don't need that.
Yeah, and you're touching on like one of the themes that will likely converge in episodes as we proceed is your recovery. Because I've been involved with a program called Celebrate Recovery for over 14 years.
Yeah.
You've been involved with it as well with me for a couple of years at least.
At least, sure.
On top of counseling and the training you got there. And so that's these concepts of recovery, or the biblical way of saying it, renewing our mind, right?
Oh, sure.
Is definitely going to be a thematic element, I think.
No doubt. And I think that's where that part, it's when we're able to talk with someone we trust, with God and someone we trust, to be able to recognize, okay, there is something else out there, and I'm able to unload that burden, that has been a weight, and I find freedom from it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned freedom, and the inverse of freedom is bondage, right? And I mean, that's what I think of when I think of, a lot of people who are clinging to whatever it was that they were taught when they were 12 and saying, this has to be what it is. I can't let this go.
Yes.
Or else. And it's like, they cling to it as a safety kind of thing. But instead, what it really looks like from outside that perspective is bondage.
Sure.
Is the inability to move away from that. You are bonded to it, right? Like you are chained to it. You can't let it go.
My security
yes.
has become my tomb, if you will,
Yeah.
or the bonding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I mean, for instance, racism, I have to believe that this is this way, or else who am I? Like, if I can't believe I'm superior than this whole other race of people, then what am I worth in this planet? Well, that's the question you should be asking. But instead, we're bonded to this ideology, whatever it is,
Yeah.
and take that and apply it, like you said, substance abuse, addiction, those kind of, if I don't have this thing, how do I solve the problems? Right. That's the truth we need to figure out. But, we get completely tied to those things and chained to those things. And again, the truth will set you free.
Yeah.
And that's the goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, go ahead.
I don't want to, even pretend to claim we have a monopoly on truth. Our goal is just to try and dig up more of it.
Exactly.
Through perspective.
Sure.
Right?
To be able to think about things a little bit differently than we might have 30 minutes ago.
Right. Yeah.
And I was thinking about how that is done in relationship. I don't think we can overlook the importance of the fact that you and I have relationship with Jesus Christ.
Right.
In that process of seeking truth, because I think, we can, as humans, we can tend to value relationship over people, over our relationship with Jesus Christ. And I think in and of that self, at that point, we just have another idol.
Yeah. That's good. Preach.
Trying not to, but I'm trying to rein in personally, because I know our tendency to kind of move on, and I want to be a little more specific in our
please do, yeah,
process.
Preach.
But I'm saying in this process, I don't want to just continue to go on down another path, but I want to recognize that this podcast is about offering the truth as we see it, based on the relationship that you and I have with those around us, with Jesus Christ, in such a way that desires to offer freedom to those that may listen. Even and I'm not saying it has to be in some profound, exhaustive, extensive way, but I think it's more about freedom for each day.
And that is one of my favorite things about some of the podcasts I listen to, is hearing it at the end of the episode. You are offered a little bit of freedom, to think about a thing differently, perspective. Sure. And so I think that's definitely
and I think it kind of comes back to that that timeline you shared.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes in the midst of the tough moment, we just need a little affirmation. That's what those podcasts provide, is just a opportunity to rethink my day and recognize that, someone is interested in my day, and it matters. My day matters. And I think, if we pull that back, even to when you were that adolescent and you were reaching out, how much different would your journey have been if someone, instead of dismissing the fact that you were a teenager, but if someone had basically said, you matter. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. I can't even fathom it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think we do that enough.
Right.
In that process of our daily lives. Because I can, like you shared earlier, I can become so internally focused, that I'm not able to accept the hope that someone else may offer to me.
I think the theme for today's podcast is go hug a teenager. They need it.
Even if it's one of your own.
That's right.
That's right. Or especially if it's
Even
one
better,
of your own. Yeah.
I know one thing we have down here too is that we want to just recognize the complexity of the topics that we'll be discussing, and we plan on taking on some big old topics, and we'll have a fun time doing it. But with the 40-ish minutes that we have to discuss it, we know we're not gonna, like I said, get a monopoly on the truth and get it all dug up, but we'll do some digging.
Yeah, and I think, that's the beauty. I like that analogy you used earlier. In the aspect of mining, we can get the nuggets, or even the dust,
or we can even get the corner of the chest uncovered and be like, hey, we know something's here. Maybe we can come back to it in the next episode or whatever. But just keep mining, keep digging. Yeah, and that'll be the fun.
It will.
Yeah,
looking forward to it.
Should we talk a little bit about some guest type of thing? Over it.
So, like you say, I mean, I think we can recognize that we're gonna do some mining, and part of that is gonna include other people. Mm-hmm. To be able to have guests, to be able to invite individuals, in here with us, as part of the perspective that we desire to create.
Yeah, because we talked about some of our differences, but really we probably have more similarities than we do differences. And so, some of those similarities, obviously, white, middle class, middle-aged, believers in Jesus Christ, as I said. In some ways, we've been lay leaders in our church. We're husbands, we're fathers, and like we talked about, seekers of truth. And so we have some very similar characteristics. And so we recognize, even in between us, we're not going to be able to get too much mining done, because we're just going to keep saying a lot of the same things in an agreement, which will be fun too. It's always fun to have someone agree with you. But that is a big part of, it will be fun to bring in some other perspectives. And we're not big time people who know, celebrities or anything like that. So we're going to bring in family, friends in the community. People who are good at what they do, in our community, and just talk about their stuff. And it'll just be fun to get a different perspective. And we get plenty of celebrity interviews and podcasts. Let's get some regular Joes in here.
That's right.
That'll be the real.
Some important people from where we come from.
That's right.
That's right.
I like it. But yeah, I think that's all we have for today. Unless
I think there's plenty more, but we'll bring it to another episode.
That's right.
Yeah, we gotta.
I'm excited, Mark.
I'm looking forward to it. I appreciate you inviting me into the opportunity.
Yes, I appreciate you embracing technology.
I'm working on it.
Even though it fought against us and we lost our first.
Hey, well, I think I dealt with that rather well in the whole process.
I'm still kicking myself. That's okay. All right.
All right.
See ya.
This is how we see it.
Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like how I see it, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.